Good evening and welcome. There is a particular kind of dread that comes not from what we see, but from what seems to see us first. Tonight's story begins with such a dread, a shadow, cast upon the wall of a London townhouse, that appeared to know the murderer's face long before Scotland Yard, long before Hercule Poirot himself, had gathered a single shred of evidence. Was it merely the trick of a gas lamp and a frightened maid's imagination? Or had something far stranger slipped into that house? Something that did not follow the living, but led them, quietly, toward death. Monsieur Poirot will need every grain of his famous little grey cells to answer that question, and I dare say, even he will not get it entirely right on the first try. Settle in. The fog is rolling over Belgravia, and the game, as they say, is afoot. Foggy Beginning London, in the winter of 1957, wore its fog like an old widow wears black, faithfully and without complaint. It rolled in from the river each evening at 4:30, thickened by 6, and by 8 had swallowed the gas lamps of Belgravia whole, leaving only faint amber halos suspended in the murk, as though the city itself were dreaming in sepia. Hercule Poirot did not care for fog. He said so, often, and at length, to anyone unfortunate enough to be sharing a taxi with him. It clings, he was saying now, to Captain Arthur Hastings, who had come up from the country for a fortnight and was already regretting it, to the coat, to the moustache, to the very soul, mon ami. A civilized city ought not to permit such weather upon itself. It's just fog, Poirot. It is never just anything, Hastings. That is where you English go so wrong. You call a thing just a fog, just a shadow, just a feeling, and then you are astonished when it turns out to be murder. Hastings, who had heard variations of this speech perhaps 400 times over the course of their long acquaintance, merely smiled and looked out of the taxi window, where Belgravia's white stucco terraces loomed and vanished, like ships passing in a channel mist. It was at that precise moment, Poirot would remember this later, with some private satisfaction, for he liked his stories to begin properly, that the taxi radio, which the driver had left murmuring low, crackled with a name he recognized. Police have been called to the residence of art dealer Mr. Edmund Wexley, of Chester Square, following what is believed to be a sudden death. "Stop the taxi," said Poirot. "Poirot, really? Hastings. Chester Square is one street from where we are sitting. I do not believe in coincidence, and I certainly do not believe in ignoring the wireless when it hands one a murder on a silver plate. It said sudden death, not murder. Hastings." Poirot's tone carried the weary patience of a man explaining that water is wet. When a man like Edmund Wexley dies suddenly, on a night such as this, it is never merely sudden. Come. Chester Square, when they reached it, had already gathered its little crowd of the curious, servants from neighbouring houses, in coats thrown hastily over nightclothes, a milkman who had arrived early and would now be very late, 2 constables attempting without much success to move people along. Poirot presented his card to the younger of the two, a fresh-faced fellow who clearly had no idea who Hercule Poirot was, and was saved from an awkward argument only by the timely arrival of Inspector Japp, who came down the front steps buttoning his coat, and looking, as he always did at a crime scene, like a man who had been personally inconvenienced by the corpse. "Well, if it isn't the little Belgian bloodhound," Japp said, without much surprise. "Might have known you'd sniff this one out before the body was cold. Come on then, since you're here, you may as well make yourself useful." The house was tall, white-fronted, and expensively furnished in the manner of a man who had spent 40 years buying beautiful things and rather fewer years learning to enjoy them. Mr. Edmund Wexley, 61, retired dealer in continental paintings, widower, a face Poirot dimly recalled from the society pages, lay in his study, in a wing-backed chair before a dying fire, with a look of mild surprise upon his face, and a small, neat wound just below the ribs that had done for him with remarkable economy. "Knife," said Japp. "Not on the premises, far as we can tell. Doctor puts it at somewhere around 9:30. No sign of forced entry. Whoever did it, Wexley let them in himself, or they'd a key." Poirot circled the chair slowly, hands clasped behind his back, taking in the room with the particular stillness he reserved for such moments. A stillness Hastings had long ago learned not to interrupt. The fire banked low, a decanter of brandy, 2 glasses, one used, a small oil painting removed from above the mantel and propped against the wall, as though someone had meant to take it and then thought better of it, or been interrupted. 2 glasses, Poirot murmured. So, he knew his visitor. Perhaps he even expected him, or her. Or her, Japp agreed, with the air of a man who had already had this same thought and filed it away. Households not short of women either. There's a niece lives here, Miss Diana Wexley, and a housekeeper, Mrs. Pruitt, and a young maid, name of Ellen Sharp. Business partner turns up too, chap called Reginald Colt, though he's got his own flat in Pimlico. And it is Miss Sharp, I think, said Poirot, who found the body. Japp's eyebrows rose a fraction. How do you know that? I did not know it, Inspector. I observed that the young constable outside was looking every few moments toward that door. He indicated a door at the rear of the hall, with the particular anxiety of a man guarding someone he believes to be in a delicate state. It is not a great deduction. It is merely paying attention, which I find is a habit sadly out of fashion. Japp snorted, but did not disagree, and led them through to the small sitting room, where the maid sat wrapped in a blanket someone had thoughtfully provided, a cup of tea untouched at her elbow, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the room she was sitting in. She was perhaps 19, Poirot judged, pale under ordinary circumstances and considerably paler now, with the reddened eyes of someone who has been crying and has now moved past crying into something quieter and more frightening. Miss Sharp, Poirot said gently, settling himself into the chair opposite her, with the careful unhurriedness of a man who has all the time in the world, though in truth he had none at all. I am told you found your master this evening. I am very sorry. It is a terrible thing to discover, and I would not ask you to speak of it again tonight, except that I believe you saw something more than the poor gentleman himself. Is this not so? The girl's eyes came up to meet his for the first time, and Poirot saw in them not merely grief, but a very particular species of fear. The fear of a person who has seen something and is no longer certain the words exist to describe it, nor whether, having found the words, anyone will believe her. "You'll think I'm mad, sir," she said. "The inspector already thinks I'm mad." "I think no such thing," said Japp, from the doorway, in a tone that suggested he rather did. "I do not think you mad, mademoiselle," said Poirot. "I think, perhaps, that you saw something that frightened you very much, and that you have not yet found anyone willing to listen to it properly." "I am willing. Tell me, what did you see?" Ellen Sharp wrapped the blanket tighter about her shoulders, as though the study's cold had followed her down the hall and into this smaller, warmer room, and would not be shaken off. "The shadow, sir," she said, "on the study wall. Before I even opened the door proper, before I'd seen Mr. Wexley at all, I saw it move across the wall by the fireplace, tall and thin, like a man standing where no man was standing. And I knew. I don't know how I knew, sir, but I knew straight away who it was. I knew who'd done it, just from looking at that shadow, before I'd even seen the body, before there was any blood to see, nothing at all to go on. I just knew." There was a silence in the small room, broken only by the settling of coals in the grate next door, and Hastings, watching his old friend's face, saw there an expression he recognized very well, the small, quick flare of interest that meant Hercule Poirot had just been handed a puzzle worth having. "Tell me, mademoiselle," Poirot said softly, "who was it that you knew?" "The shadow's testimony. I knew it was Mr. Colt," said Ellen Sharp, and then, seeing the effect this produced on Inspector Japp's face, added quickly, "Only I don't know it, sir. Not really. It's only what the shadow made me feel, if that makes any sense at all, which I don't suppose it does." "It makes a good deal of sense," said Poirot, though his tone was mild, almost soothing, "and none at all, both at the same time, which is precisely why we must examine it very carefully, rather than either believing it entirely or dismissing it entirely. Tell me, mademoiselle, this shadow, was it a man's shadow? Did it have, perhaps, the shape of a hat, a coat, some particular outline that reminded you of Mr. Colt?" The girl frowned, working at some knot of memory. "It was tall, sir, thin, and it seemed to lean, somehow, the way Mr. Colt leans when he's talking to Mr. Wexley in that study, always leaning in close as if he's telling a secret. But I couldn't say it was his hat, or his coat, or anything so definite as that. It was only a feeling that came over me, quick as anything, before I'd even thought about it." "A feeling," Poirot repeated, and Hastings, who knew his friend's opinions on the unreliability of feelings unaccompanied by fact, expected some gentle skepticism to follow. It did not come. Instead, Poirot merely nodded, as though filing the observation away in one of the small, precise drawers of his mind, to be examined later, at leisure. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful, and braver than you know. Rest now, if you can." He rose and gestured Japp and Hastings out into the hall, where he permitted himself, at last, a small sigh. A shadow that leans, Japp. A shadow that suggests a name before there is any evidence to suggest it. This is either the invention of a frightened girl's mind, which is possible and common and nothing to build a case upon, or it is something considerably more interesting. Or, said Japp dryly, it's exactly what it looks like. The maid's sweet on somebody, or frightened of somebody, and her mind did the rest. Fog and firelight play tricks. I've seen it before. You have seen it before, Poirot agreed. But there is also a second witness, is there not? The young constable. He too claims to have seen this shadow, before he ever entered the house. Japp's expression soured slightly, in the manner of a policeman being reminded of an inconvenient fact. Fenwick. Yes. Swears blind he saw something pass across the study curtains from the street, before he'd even knocked at the door. Tall, thin, like the girl says. Doesn't help that he's young and impressionable, and was half frozen stood out there in the fog for an hour. Then let us speak with young Constable Fenwick, said Poirot, and after him, I think, with Mr. Reginald Colt, since it is his shadow, apparently, that has already been tried and half convicted by the imaginations of two independent witnesses before we have so much as asked him where he was this evening. Constable Fenwick proved to be a solid, sensible-looking young man of perhaps 23, the sort Poirot generally trusted rather more than excitable maids or nervous airs, precisely because he seemed faintly embarrassed by his own testimony, as though he wished very much that he had seen nothing at all. "I don't rightly know how to put it, sir," Fenwick said, turning his helmet over in his hands. "I was on my beat, coming round the square, and I saw, through the gap in the study curtains, where they didn't quite meet, a shape, tall, moving slow, like it was pacing. And I thought to myself, that's a queer way for old Wexley to be carrying on this late, because I know his habits, sir, being on this beat 3 years now, and he's not one to pace of an evening. He sits, reads his paper. That's Mr. Wexley of an evening, regular as church bells. And then I went on my way, sir, thinking nothing more of it, until I come back round 20 minutes later, and there's the maid at the door screaming blue murder, if you'll excuse the expression, and it all came back to me at once, sudden-like. That shape, pacing. I couldn't have told you then it meant anything, but the moment I heard he was dead, I knew, sir, same as she says, that the shape I'd seen weren't Mr. Wexley at all, but whoever done for him." Poirot's eyes had narrowed slightly during this recitation, in the manner of a man doing careful arithmetic. "Constable, this is of the greatest importance, and I ask you to think most carefully before you answer. When you looked through the gap in the curtains, did you see a man, or did you see, as Mademoiselle Sharp puts it, only a shadow?" Fenwick hesitated, and in that hesitation, Poirot saw something he had been waiting for. "Now you put it that way, sir. I couldn't rightly swear to a man at all. There weren't but the one gap in the curtain, and what I saw was more the shape thrown up on the far wall than anyone standing at the window itself. I took it for a man, natural enough. What else would it be? But if you're asking did I see a face, or a coat, or anything of that kind, no, sir. I saw a shadow, and I took it for a man, and I don't rightly know, now you've made me think on it, which of those two things I actually saw." Japp let out a long breath through his nose, the sound of a policeman watching a promising piece of evidence dissolve gently into fog. "There," he said, "just as I thought. Nothing but shadows and nerves." "On the contrary, Japp," said Poirot, and there was something new in his voice now, a quickening. "I think Constable Fenwick has just told us something very important indeed, though he does not yet know what it is, and nor, I confess, do I. But a shadow that is mistaken for a man by a sensible policeman, and a shadow that suggests a particular name to a frightened maid, before either of them has any evidence upon which to hang such an impression, this is not carelessness, mes amis. This has the shape, unless I am very much mistaken, of something arranged. Arranged by who? That," said Poirot, reaching for his hat, "is what we shall now go and ask Mr. Reginald Colt, though I think, when we do, We ought not to mention the shadow at all, and see instead what he tells us of his own accord, a wrong turn. Reginald Colt received them in his flat in Pimlico, with the slightly overdone composure of a man who has rehearsed, in the privacy of his own mirror, exactly how a grieving business partner ought to look, and has not quite got it right. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed in the manner of a man who bought his suits carefully and wore them a season too long, with a thin face and a habit, Poirot noted it at once, of leaning forward when he spoke, as though sharing a confidence, even when the subject was as unconfidential as the weather. Edmund and I built that business together, Monsieur Poirot, from nothing. Wexley and Colt, you'll have heard the name, 22 years. He leaned forward now, on cue, and Poirot watched Hastings's eyebrows twitch very slightly upward. I can hardly believe he's gone. Who could have wished such a thing on him? That, said Poirot pleasantly, is precisely what I am hoping you will help me discover. You dined with him this evening, I am told. I did. We often did, of a Thursday. Business talk, mostly. We'd a sale coming up at Christie's, some paintings to authenticate. I left at, 9 o'clock, perhaps a little after. He was in excellent spirits when I left him. And the second brandy glass in his study. You did not take a nightcap before you left. A flicker, small, quickly suppressed, crossed Colt's face. I don't recall a second glass, Monsieur Poirot. Perhaps Edmund poured one for himself after I'd gone. It was a small lie, or Poirot judged it so. The leaning forward, the too quick recovery, the faint dampness that had appeared at Colt's temple despite the coolness of the room, all of it pointed, in Poirot's experience, toward a man concealing something. And here, Poirot would later admit to Hastings with rather more candour than he generally permitted himself. He made his error. He became so absorbed in the shape of Colt's deception that he mistook its size. Monsieur Colt, Poirot said, leaning forward himself now, matching the other man's posture, in a manner Hastings recognized as deliberate. I put it to you plainly. You did not leave at 9. You remained considerably later, and it was you who took the second brandy. And it is you, I believe, whose shadow was seen upon the study wall by not one but 2 independent witnesses. It was, Hastings reflected afterward, a rather theatrical accusation to make on the strength of a leaning posture and a bead of sweat. And Colt's reaction, when it came, was not the reaction of a guilty man cornered, but the reaction of an innocent one, thoroughly alarmed. Shadows? What shadows? Good God, man, I left this house, Edmund's house, at 9 o'clock precisely, and I can prove it, because I stopped at Pemberton's on the corner of Ebury Street for cigarettes, and the tobacconist there knows me by name and will tell you so himself. As for the second glass, Colt's composure cracked, just slightly, into something more human and less rehearsed. Edmund had a young woman visiting him some evenings. Not what you're implying, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing improper, but he'd asked me most particularly not to mention it, and I've been trying to honour that these last hours, even with the poor man not yet cold, which I dare say makes me a fool, but there it is. Poirot sat back, and Hastings, watching him, saw the small, private grimace of a man recognising his own misstep. A look Poirot wore rarely, and never for long, but wore now with something that might almost have been described, in a lesser man, as embarrassment. A young woman, Poirot said slowly. You will forgive me, Monsieur Colt. I confess I allowed your evident discomfort to lead me toward a conclusion your discomfort did not in fact support. This is a fault of mine. I see the shape of a lie, and too quickly I assume I know its contents. Tell me of this young woman, if you please, and forgive an old man his haste. Diana didn't know, if that's what you're thinking, Colt said, some of his earlier stiffness returning, though softer now, more genuinely wounded. Edmund's niece. She thought her uncle had no visitors of that kind at all, thought him quite past it, if I may be blunt, and I don't believe he was courting anyone improper, only that there was a woman, a Mrs. Vane, a widow from Cheyne Walk, who came sometimes of an evening to play cards and talk, and Edmund was oddly private about it, ashamed almost, as men of his generation sometimes are of anything that looks like courtship at 61. I stopped by Pemberton's, I went home, and that is the whole of my evening, and I'll thank you not to go accusing me of murder on the strength of a leaning chair and a warm room, Monsieur Poirot. Later, walking back through the thinning fog with Hastings, Poirot was quiet for some time. quiet in the particular way that meant he was turning something over rather unhappily. I was wrong, Hastings. Happens to the best of us. It happens to me rather less than you seem to imagine, mon ami, which is precisely why, when it does happen, I find it instructive to sit with the discomfort rather than hurry past it. I saw a man leaning forward and sweating, and I built in my mind an entire edifice of guilt upon so slight a foundation, because it was elegant, because it fit the shadow the maid had described. I forgot the first rule I am forever repeating to you, that a man may lie about one thing and be entirely innocent of another. He shook his head. The shadow named Colt. Colt is innocent of murder, though guilty of a small, foolish loyalty to a dead friend's privacy. So who, then, did that shadow truly belong to? And why did it lean, Hastings, in a manner so precisely suited to make two witnesses think of the one man in this affair least likely to have done it? Cracks in the theory. By the following morning, the fog had thinned to a pale grey haze, and Poirot, breakfasting at his flat with the meticulous ceremony he brought to all things, found himself reading Japp's early notes with the particular attention of a man who suspects he has been looking at a puzzle upside down. "Mrs. Vane," he said to Hastings, over the eggs, "a widow of Chain Walk. This is our next call, I think, before we trouble Miss Diana Wexley or the housekeeper further. If Monsieur Colt speaks true, she may have been the last person, besides the murderer, to see Edmund Wexley alive." Mrs. Vane proved to be a handsome woman, of perhaps 55, composed and dry-eyed in a manner that Poirot found, on the whole, more informative than tears would have been. "Yes, I was there," she said, without being asked twice. "I left at 9:30, Monsieur Poirot, and I see no reason to be ashamed of it, whatever Reginald Colt may have thought fit to keep quiet about. Edmund and I were old friends, becoming, perhaps, something rather more than friends, and if that scandalizes the neighbors, I find I no longer have the patience to care. You left him alive and well." "Alive, certainly. Well," she hesitated, and here Poirot leaned in, sensing the true purpose of his visit approaching at last. "He was troubled that evening, distracted. I asked him twice what the matter was, and twice he waved it away. But as I was leaving, he said something I have thought of constantly since. He said, 'Someone has been asking after the Vermeer, Louisa, and I do not like the way they asked.' The Vermeer? A small painting. I never saw it myself. He kept it in the study, above the mantel, I believe. He never spoke of it directly, only that it was worth a very great deal, and that its provenance was, his word, delicate." Poirot's mind went at once to the study as he had seen it, the small oil painting removed from above the mantel, propped against the wall, as though someone had meant to take it and been interrupted. "Madame, this is of the first importance. Did he say who had been asking?" "No, only that it troubled him. I assumed some dealer, some rival. Edmund had rivals enough in his line of work. Jealous men who never forgave him his eye for a genuine piece among 10 forgeries." She paused. "There was one name he mentioned, now I think of it. Not in connection with the painting, but earlier in the evening, almost in passing. He said he'd had a letter from a man named Harding. Grew quite pale reading it, I thought, though he told me it was nothing." Back in the taxi, Hastings watched his friend's face and recognized the particular stillness of a man rebuilding a structure from its foundations upward. "Harding," Poirot murmured. "A name not yet mentioned to us by anyone in that house, Hastings, which is interesting in itself. And a painting, delicate in its provenance, removed from its place upon the wall and never taken. Why remove a thing and not take it, unless one had come not to steal it, but to look at it, to confirm something about it, and was disturbed before the looking was complete? Or the murderer already knew what he needed to know, and moved the painting merely to search behind it? Now you are thinking, mon ami, though I confess I had not considered a hiding place behind the frame. We must return to Chester Square and look most carefully this time at the wall itself, not merely the shadow that fell upon it." They found Detective Inspector Japp already at the house, in a mood Poirot recognized as the particular irritability of a policeman whose case has just become more complicated rather than less. "You'll want to hear this," Japp said, without preamble. "Had a call this morning from a solicitor's office. Seems our Mr. Wexley changed his will 6 weeks back, cut his niece Diana out almost entirely, left the bulk of the estate, including whatever's in that study, to a trust for the National Gallery. Miss Wexley didn't know a thing about it, or so she swears, and her fiancé's none too pleased either, seeing as they were rather relying on that inheritance to set up house. A motive, said Poirot slowly, for Miss Wexley, and perhaps for her fiancé also, though a motive of 6 weeks' standing does not explain why the murder happened last night, and not before. Something changed, Japp. Something happened yesterday that made last night, and not some other night, the night this crime became necessary, the letter from Harding, the questions about the Vermeer. We are close, I think, to understanding the shape of this, though I confess to you both that I do not yet see it whole. He turned back toward the house, toward the study, toward the pale rectangle of unfaded wallpaper, where a small painting had hung, for who knew how many years above a dead man's mantle, and where, unless Poirot was very much mistaken, the true beginning of this story, not its ending, but its beginning, had quietly taken place weeks before the shadow ever fell upon the wall at all. The truth behind the darkness. The letter, when Japp's men finally traced it, had come from a Mr. Cornelius Harding of Amsterdam, a name known, it transpired, in certain quiet circles of the art world as a man who dealt not in paintings, but in the truth of paintings, an examiner of provenance, a man whose opinion could make a canvas worth a fortune or worth nothing at all, in the space of a single letter. He wrote to Wexley, Japp reported, reading from a telegram reply, saying he'd new information suggesting the so-called Vermeer wasn't a Vermeer at all, some workshop copy, decent enough to fool most eyes, but not decent enough to fool Harding's. Wexley'd sold 3 paintings from that same source over the years, all authenticated by Wexley's own eye, mind you, and all fetching very handsome prices to very trusting buyers. And if Harding's letter became known, said Poirot quietly, Monsieur Wexley's reputation, the entire foundation of Wexley and Colt, 22 years of careful work, collapses in an afternoon. Every sale he ever authenticated becomes suspect. Every buyer wonders if he has been cheated. Which, Japp said, gives Reginald Colt rather more motive than a lie about cigarettes and a lady friend. Wouldn't you say? Whole business ruined, his own name dragged down with Wexley's. It gives him motive, Poirot agreed. But Monsieur Colt's account of Pemberton's tobacconist will hold, I think, precisely because it is so easily checked and he offered it so readily. A man does not invent an alibi that any policeman may confirm within the hour, unless the alibi is true. No, Colt's motive is real, but his hands, I think, are clean. He rose and walked once more into the study, standing now before the pale rectangle on the wallpaper where the painting had hung, running his fingers lightly along its edge with the particular tenderness he reserved for objects that might, at any moment, tell him something true. Hastings, come and look at this, if you please. What do you see? Hastings looked, wallpaper, faded around the edges where the frame kept the sun off it, and the shape of the fading, observe it closely, mon ami. It is not the shape of the painting Madame Vane described to us, small, she said, no larger than a lady's handbag. This fading is larger, considerably larger. There was a different painting here once, and for far longer than the little Vermeer occupied this spot. Japp, standing in the doorway, frowned. Meaning what? Meaning, Inspector, that Edmund Wexley did not merely doubt the authenticity of one small painting. I think he had begun, in these last weeks, to doubt a great deal more than that, and I think somebody in this house knew precisely how much doubting he had begun to do, and could not permit him to finish it. It was at this moment that Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, a stout, grey-haired woman who had said almost nothing in 2 days of questioning beyond the barest necessities, appeared in the doorway with a tray she did not seem entirely to remember carrying, and stood very still when she saw what Poirot was examining. "You knew this room well, madame," Poirot said, without turning. 20 years in this house, I am told. You would know better than anyone what has hung upon that wall, and when and why it changed." The tray trembled very slightly in Mrs. Pruitt's hands. "There was a bigger painting, sir, years back. Sold it, he did, when Mr. Colt's business had a lean year. Sold off half the good pieces quiet-like, so no one would think Wexley and Colt was struggling. Bought smaller ones after, prettier for showing off. Not so dear underneath, if you take my meaning." "I take your meaning very well, madame. And this letter from Monsieur Harding, the master received it, what, 3 days ago? 4? 4 days, sir. I brought it up myself with his tea, and I never saw a man's face change so quick in all my years in service. White as this tablecloth, he went, and shut himself in this study near an hour before he'd speak a word to anyone. And in these 4 days, madame, did Monsieur Wexley speak to you of what troubled him? Old servants, I find, are trusted with a great deal that family and business partners are never permitted to hear. The tray came down, at last, upon the side table, with a small, defeated clatter. He said he meant to make it right, sir. Said he'd write to every buyer who'd trusted his eye these 20 years and tell them the truth of it, whatever it cost him, because he couldn't die with that on his conscience. Those were his very words, sir. Die with that on my conscience. And I've not been able to forget them since, not for 1 hour. And who, Poirot asked, very gently now, did that confession stand to ruin most completely, madame? Not Monsieur Colt, whose alibi is sound. Not Miss Diana, who did not know of her uncle's business troubles at all. Who in this house stood to lose everything the moment Edmund Wexley decided to tell the truth? Mrs. Pruitt did not answer, but her eyes moved, involuntarily, toward the window, toward the square outside, where a young man in a good coat was at that moment climbing the front steps. A young man Poirot had seen once before, briefly, in a photograph on Diana Wexley's mantelpiece, introduced to him only in passing as her fiancé. Mr. Gerald Fenn, Poirot said softly, following her gaze, whose engagement to Miss Wexley depends rather more than she perhaps realizes upon her uncle's fortune remaining a fortune, and upon her uncle's reputation remaining unstained. Japp, I think it is time we asked Monsieur Fenn a great many questions about where, precisely, he was standing at 9:30 last night, and whether he has ever, in the course of his courtship, found occasion to stand rather too close to a gas lamp outside a certain study window. The gathering. Gerald Fenn was young, younger than Poirot had expected, no more than 28, with the sort of handsome, anxious face that photographs kindly but interrogates poorly. He had gone very still on the front step when Japp's hand closed, not ungently, upon his arm, and stiller still when he was shown into the drawing-room where, by early evening, Poirot had arranged for the whole cast of this small, sad drama to assemble. Diana Wexley, pale and composed in black, Reginald Colt, still faintly resentful of the previous day's accusation, Mrs. Vane, arrived at Poirot's particular request, Mrs. Pruitt, standing near the door as though she might, at any moment, be called upon to serve tea to a room that had no appetite for it, and Ellen Sharp, brought down from her attic room, twisting her handkerchief with the fine, steady tension of a clock spring. "I have asked you all here," Poirot began, standing before the cold fireplace with his hands clasped behind him, in the manner of a small, precise conductor, before an orchestra that did not yet know what piece it was about to play, because I believe I understand, now, both the manner of Monsieur Wexley's death and the meaning of the shadow that 2 honest witnesses saw upon that study wall before ever a body was discovered. I will tell you the story as I believe it happened, and you will correct me if I am wrong, though I do not think this time that I am. He let the silence settle a moment before continuing. Edmund Wexley, 4 days before his death, received a letter that threatened to destroy the reputation upon which his entire life's work was built. Being, whatever his professional sins, a man of some conscience, he resolved to confess the truth to those he had wronged, whatever the cost to himself. This resolve, mesdames et messieurs, was a death sentence, though he did not know it, and I do not think he ever suspected the hand that would carry it out. Diana Wexley's composure had begun, very slightly, to crack. Her gloved hands gripped one another in her lap. "Mr. Fenn," Poirot continued, turning now to the young man, whose face had gone the colour of the wallpaper behind him, "your engagement to Miss Wexley was, I think, a happy one, genuinely so, and I do not for one moment suggest otherwise. But it was also, forgive me, an engagement that depended a great deal upon Miss Wexley's expected inheritance, since I am told your own prospects, however respectable, are modest. When Monsieur Wexley's confession became known, as within days it must have, that inheritance would have shrivelled to very little, buried beneath lawsuits and scandal and the ruin of the family name you hoped soon to share." "This is monstrous," Fenn managed. "I love Diana for herself, not for—" "I believe you," said Poirot mildly, which seemed to unsettle the young man rather more than an accusation would have done. I believe entirely that you loved Mademoiselle Wexley for herself. But love, mon ami, has driven better men than you to worse follies than the one I believe you committed. Not murder, but something that led to it all the same." The room had gone very quiet. "You came to Chester Square last night," Poirot said, "not to kill Edmund Wexley, but to plead with him, to beg him to reconsider his confession, to think of his niece's future before his own conscience. You waited outside, I think, until Madame Vane had departed, and let yourself in with the key Miss Wexley had given you some months before, for visits she did not wish her uncle to know of just yet. You went into the study, you argued, and in the course of that argument, standing before the fire with the gas lamp behind you throwing your shape large and strange across the wall, you were seen by Constable Fenwick through the gap in the curtain, and later, in memory only, by Mademoiselle Sharp as she entered. Though neither of them saw a man at all, they saw only a shadow. Your shadow, Monsieur Fenn, thrown large by the fire behind you, pacing as a desperate man paces. I didn't kill him," Fenn's voice had risen. "I swear before God, Monsieur Poirot, I left him alive, angry, shaken, but alive. I couldn't move him, and I left in despair, near 10 o'clock, and that is the whole truth of it." "I believe that also," said Poirot, and something in his tone made every person in the room lean, almost imperceptibly, forward. "For here is the second half of this sad story, and the true murderer of Edmund Wexley, the one whose shadow was mistaken for yours, Monsieur Fenn, because your shadow had already taught 2 witnesses what shape to expect upon that wall." He turned, at last, to the housekeeper standing near the door. "Mrs. Pruitt, you told me, only hours ago, that Monsieur Wexley confided in you a great deal these past 4 days. More, I think, than he confided even in Madame Vane, whom he loved, or in his own niece, whom he had raised. You have been in that house 20 years. You watched him sell away the good paintings quietly rather than admit the business struggled. You have, I think, protected the name of Wexley far longer and far more fiercely than any hired servant reasonably ought. Because it was never merely his name you were protecting, was it, madame?" Mrs. Pruitt's face, which had held its composure through 2 days of questioning, came apart all at once, like a dam long strained finally giving way. "He would have destroyed everything," she said, and her voice was low, almost wondering, as though she were only now, for the first time, hearing her own reasons spoken aloud. 20 years I gave that house, Monsieur Poirot. Not as a housekeeper only, though that is what they called me. Edmund and I, we had an understanding once, long before Louisa Vane ever came calling, before his wife died even, if I'm honest, though nothing improper ever came of it, not truly. And when his confession came out, when the lawsuits came, when the house was sold to pay his debts of honour, where does an old housekeeper go, Monsieur Poirot, at 58 years of age, with no name of her own and no family left, when the only home and the only man she has ever loved is dragged through every newspaper in London and dies of shame within the year regardless? I did not plan it. I swear to you I did not plan it. I went in after Mr. Fenn left, meaning only to beg Edmund one last time to think of what he was destroying for all of us, not himself alone. And he would not hear me. He called me foolish, sentimental, said his conscience mattered more than any of our comforts, and something in me simply broke. The room held its breath. The knife was his own, from the desk drawer, kept for cutting the string on parcels of paintings. I did not go in intending it. I want that understood, whatever else you believe of me. But when it was done, I could not undo it, and I thought, God forgive me, I thought if I moved that little painting from the wall, left it disturbed, it might look like theft, like some stranger's doing, and no one would ever think to look at the housekeeper who had served him faithfully 20 years. Japp, who had been standing very still through all of this, stepped forward at last, and his voice, when it came, was gentler than Hastings had ever heard it at the close of a case. "Mrs. Pruitt, I'll have to ask you to come with me now." She nodded, gathering what remained of her dignity about her like a coat, and it was Poirot, oddly, who looked away first, toward the window, where the last grey light of the afternoon was fading over Chester Square, and where, Hastings thought, no shadow at all now moved upon the glass, only the ordinary, blameless dark of an ordinary London evening. Resolution. The fog had lifted entirely by the time Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings walked back along Chester Square, and London, in the manner of cities that have witnessed a great many tragedies and long ago made their peace with witnessing more, had already begun to arrange itself back into its ordinary evening rhythms, a lamplighter making his rounds, a nanny wheeling a perambulator homeward, the distant, cheerful clatter of a milk cart that had, at last, finished its very long day. "You are quiet, Hastings," Poirot observed. "I was thinking of her, Mrs. Pruitt." Hastings shook his head. "It's an odd sort of murder, isn't it? Not greed, not really, not even fear for herself alone. She loved him, 20 years of loving him quietly, and in the end, that love is what killed him." "It is, I think, the saddest kind of murder there is," Poirot said, and for once there was no theatricality in it, no small performance for an audience of one. The murder committed not from wickedness, but from a love that has curdled slowly, over years, into something that can no longer tell the difference between protecting a person and destroying him. She did not wish Edmund Wexley dead, Hastings. She wished, I think, for the world to remain exactly as it had always been, for the comfortable fiction of Wexley and Colt, of the good name, of her own quiet place within that house, to continue undisturbed forever. When he threatened to tell the truth, he threatened not merely his own ruin, but the ruin of the only life she had built for herself. And so, in one terrible moment by the fire, the woman who had spent 20 years protecting him killed him instead. And the shadow, Poirot allowed himself, at last, a small, tired smile. The shadow, mon ami, was never anything more than a trick of firelight and a young man's guilty pacing. And yet it was also, I think, something rather more than that, if one is permitted a moment of fancy at the close of a long day. Constable Fenwick saw Monsieur Fenn's shadow and mistook it for a stranger's, because a nervous young man pacing before a fire in another man's study throws precisely such a shape. Mademoiselle Sharp, arriving perhaps 40 minutes later, saw no shadow at all upon that wall, for by then poor Wexley was already dead, and the fire had burned low. But her mind, primed by shock and by whatever half-heard rumour of Monsieur Colt's frequent leaning visits to that study, supplied a shadow where none any longer existed, and a name to match it. 2 witnesses, 2 shadows, and neither shadow the true murderer's own. It is, I think, the great lesson of this unhappy case, that a shadow tells us only the shape of our own fears and assumptions, and very rarely the shape of the truth. We must always look behind it, Hastings, at what casts it, and I confess that even I, this time, spent rather too many hours admiring the shadow itself before I thought to look at the fire. You got there in the end. I got there, Poirot agreed, somewhat more slowly than I would have liked, and by way of one confident accusation that proved entirely wrong, which I do not enjoy admitting, though I find upon reflection that admitting it costs a man rather less than pretending otherwise. He paused at the corner, where a taxi stood waiting, its driver dozing gently over the wheel. Monsieur Colt will keep his business, tarnished though the name may be. Mademoiselle Wexley will keep her young man, and I think, in time, a rather smaller inheritance than she once expected, though I suspect she will find she does not mind it so very much. Once the shock has passed, there was real feeling in that young man's voice. Hastings, whatever folly drove him to Chester Square that night. And Madame Vane, I think, will grieve longest and most privately of anyone, for she alone loved Edmund Wexley, without any complication of money or name attached to it at all. And Mrs. Pruitt? Poirot was silent for a moment, watching the lamplighter's small flame move from post to post along the square, each one catching, holding, glowing steady against the coming dark. Mrs. Pruitt, he said at last, will go to trial, and I do not think any jury in England will find much mercy for a woman who took up a knife against the man who trusted her, whatever her reasons. And yet, he sighed, a small, very human sound. I confess, Hastings, that I close this case with rather less satisfaction than I generally permit myself. There is no triumph in unmasking a murderer who murdered from love, grown twisted and afraid, rather than from greed grown bold. I would almost have preferred a villain I could dislike cleanly. This one, I find, I can only pity, which is a most inconvenient feeling for a detective to carry home with him, and one I do not recommend to you, mon ami, should you ever take up this peculiar trade yourself. He climbed into the taxi, and Hastings followed, and for a little while Neither man spoke as the cab pulled away from Chester Square, past the tall white houses with their curtained windows, each one holding, no doubt, some ordinary evening's worth of small secrets that would never trouble Scotland Yard at all. "Fog's clearing properly now," Hastings said eventually, looking out at the square giving way to clearer streets beyond. "Yes," said Poirot, and there was something almost wistful in it. "It generally does, Hastings, in the end, though I have learned over a long career that it is rarely the fog itself one ought to fear. It is only ever what the fog permits us not to look at too closely, for just a little while, before the truth insists, as it always does, upon being seen." The taxi turned the corner, and Chester Square, and the house upon it, and the pale rectangle of wallpaper where a painting had once hung above a dead man's mantel, slipped quietly out of sight behind them, into the ordinary dark of an ordinary London night, a night which held, Poirot did not doubt, 100 other small shadows, each one waiting patiently for someone to look behind it.